In this tutorial, we're going to be looking at React's Context API and how it can be used for state management. Currently, I am using a component from Material UI, which is the data grid, to render data that I have hard-coded into the component. Before I move this into context, I want to show you how this has been written. So let's come back over to VS Code, and I have a page component here called posts, and this is where I'm using the data grid component from Material UI. So as you can see, this is where I'm rendering the component, and the two most important props that I'm passing here are rows and columns. So let's take a quick look at what they are. So this is the columns array, and these are all of the fields within the data I want to render on the table. So as you can see here, I have fields for ID, title, and body, and if I look at them within the browser, you'll see those are the columns I have on my table. So I have the ID, title, and body. And if I look at the rows, this is where I'm hard coding the data in the component, and this is also what I want to move into the Context API. But at the moment, this is just stored in a variable hard coded on the component. We're just passing that into the data grid, but as you can see, the fields here reflect what I'm passing into the columns. So again, I have ID, title, and body. So this is the first thing that we want to change. Instead of having this hard-coded on the component, we want to move this into the Context API. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder within my source directory called providers. And then within my providers folder, I'm going to have another folder for my posts context. And within that, I'm going to have my files. So I'm going to have my posts provider here. Now, the reason I've created a providers directory is because I'm going to use this folder to contain all of the different contexts that I create in the application. So it's just a nice way to manage the different contexts that you create. All right, so to create the context, all we're going to do at the top of the file is just import React and something else from React. So what we want to import as well is create context. And then to use this, all we have to do is create and export our posts context. And to use this, we just say create context, and we pass in the data, which I'm going to store in posts. So let's come back over to our component and grab the array that we previously have hard-coded into the component. And I'm just going to pass that into my context and into my posts. So I'm already exporting this. So to use and access this in my component, all I need to do is import the context. So again, I'm going to import that from the providers folder in the posts and my post provider. And then I just need to import my posts context. To use that, I need to import another hook from React, which is the useContext hook. And then at the top of the function, I just need to call that hook. So I'll say useContext and pass in my posts context. And that will allow me to destructure posts, which I can then pass into the data grid for the rows prop. Now when I do that, if I come back over to the browser, you're going to see that it looks the same. The only difference is that we're now getting the data from context. So the next thing that we need to do is create our provider. Now the reason that we need to create a provider is because we need to use it to wrap our entire application. And the reason we do that is because if we have multiple components that are using the context, then if there are any changes within that context and within the data, then those components need a single common ancestor that can be used to update all of the components that are using that context. All right, so if that didn't make sense, then just bear with me. I'm sure it will as we move through the tutorial. So what we're going to do is come back over to VS Code, And within my posts provider, what I'm going to do is underneath the context. So we need to use our post context to actually create our provider. But underneath that, what we're going to do is just say const posts provider. And what we're going to do is we're going to return our posts context dot provider, and we need to render the children that are passed into this component. So that is how we create our provider. But we also need to remember to export our posts provider here. Before I show you how to use this provider, I want to use the useReducer hook to create some further abstractions to simplify our code and just improve the overall quality. So to do that, what I'm going to do is within my post directory here, I'm going to create a new file called my posts_reducer.js, and I'm going to create my reducer here. So it's also going to require some small refactors on our context, but I'll get to that shortly. So what we want to do here, first of all, is actually just create our reducer. So we'll say const posts, I'll say posts reducer, and again, this is just going to take some state and an action, and it's just going to be a switch function, which is going to switch on this action.type, and we're going to have a default case to begin with, and we're just going to return the state. Okay, so we just need to remember to export this by default. So we'll export our posts reducer here, and then what we need to do is create some initial state. So this is where we need to make a small refactor, because if you're familiar with Redux, you might think that what we're going to do is pass some initial state here, but that's not actually how we are going to use the useReducer hook. So we actually need to pass in the initial state into our useReducer hook. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a const here called which I need to export, and I'm going to call this my posts initial state, right? And I'm going to take the object that we're currently passing into our context. Okay, I'm going to take this posts array, and I'm going to put that here within my posts initial state object. And the reason I do that is because I want to avoid having to maintain two objects, and I'm going to explain that shortly. So let's come back over to our posts provider and import that object. So I'm going to import that from my reducer, so post reducer. We're going to import our posts initial state, and I'm just going to use the spread operator to pass it into create context. Now the reason I've done that is because we need to import also the useReducer hook, and we're also going to need to import our posts reducer here, which is the default export from our reducer. So now that we've done that, to actually use it, what we're going to do here is we're going to say we want to call the useReducer hook here, and we're going to pass in two things. The first thing is our posts reducer, and the second is our posts initial state. So as you can see, we need to pass this into two places. So to be able to maintain that in one file, I'm simply exporting it from the posts reducer. Now the reason we want to use the useReducer hook is because it allows us to have a single store and a single dispatch that we can use to really leverage that in the application. So what we can do here is just say const and destructure from our store. We can destructure our posts, and this is what we need to pass into our provider. So here we will pass to the value prop, an object with our posts. And we're going to use that a lot more later on in the tutorial, but for now, that's fine. So now that we've done all of that boilerplate code, what we can do is we can actually use the provider. So to use it, we need to come to the root of our application, and we need to wrap our application around all the components that want to use this context. Now, you could do that in several places. You could do that in the root of the application and just wrap the entire app. The problem is that you might have multiple providers, and you might not need to use those providers on every single route. So the way I like to do it is on my app.js, where I have I'm using React Router DOM here, and where I actually define my routes, I simply import the provider here. So I'm going to say my posts provider. I'm simply going to import that here. So providers, posts, post provider, and I'm going to wrap the routes that I want to use this provider for. So I actually want to wrap both of my routes here. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap both of my routes with my provider. Now, anything inside of the provider will now have access to the context. Okay, so let's look at how we can make some changes to the data we store in context. So the first thing I'm going to do is work on my add new post form. So I'm using this to actually create new posts, which I want to render within my posts table. So let's look at how this component is built. So I have this page component for add post. And within this, again, I'm just using material UI. I have some initial form state, which I'm passing in using the useState hook. These are my form components. They have a name and value prop. So I'm binding the value of this text field to that I have stored in my state. And then on the change event, so when someone types in that input, I'm getting the value and the name, and I'm basically updating the state here. And then on submit, so on the on submit event of the form, all I'm doing is I'm getting those form values, and I am generating a random ID that we need to use when we are passing the data to our data grid. So we need to have an ID generated for each of those. We need an action that we can dispatch to update our context with our new post. So to create that, let's come back over to VS Code and go into our post provider. And on this file, we need to create a new function called create post. And it's going to take a post. And then we're going to call dispatch with a type and payload. Now I'm going to create a types file. So I'm going to call this post.types.js. And on this, we're just going to export default an object. And I'm going to say create post. And again, the value should be the same as the name of the key. Right? So now I'm going to come back over to my posts provider, and I'm going to import my types file. So I'll say posts types, and I'm going to import that from my post types. So where I'm dispatching this action for create post, I'm going to say post types dot create post, and the payload is going to be the post, which is passed into the function. Okay. So now that I've done that, right, I'm going to pass create post into my provider's value prop. So this is an object that we're passing into our provider. And this is how we keep all of the components in sync using this provider. So now that when this gets dispatched, nothing is going to happen until we update our reducer. So at the top of the reducer file, before we create our new case, I'm going to import my posts types. We'll import that from our post types. And then I'm going to create a new case on my switch function here. So I'll say post types dot create post, and here we're just going to return our state, but we're going to make a change to our posts array where we're going to pass in our state dot posts, but I'm going to also add my action dot payload to add my new post. Okay. So now that I've done that, all we need to do is update the component so that we actually call the function to dispatch our new action. So to do that, we need to actually import our context. So on this file, what I'm going to do is I'm going to import from the providers, posts, and my posts provider. I'm going to import my posts context. To use the context, again, I need to import the useContext hook. And then at the top of the function, to get access to that context, all I have to do is call the useContext hook and pass in my posts context. And then again, I have access to create post. So now within my handle submit function, what I can do is I can actually dispatch that function here. So I can just call create post and pass in the config, which is where I'm actually getting the form data. Now, before I test this in the browser, I actually want to change the functionality a little bit. I just want to redirect the user back to the home page after they've added a new post. So to do that, I'm going to import something from reactjs DOM, which is the useHistory hook. And at the top of the function, I'm just going to say const history and call the useHistory hook. And then what I'll be able to do is after I dispatch that to create a new post, I'm just going to call history.push and push the user back to the home page. Okay, so let's come back over to the browser. And as you can see, I currently have 5 posts. I'm going to add a new post. So I'm just going to say another great post, some content, and then I'm going to click on add. And as you can see, I have my first 5 posts, but I now have the 6th. So I'll click on the next page, and as you can see, this is my new post that I just added to the context. Now, just to make things a little bit easier to work with, let's come back over to our posts page, and rather than having a page size of 5, let's just increase that to 10. And that just means that as I add new items to, they're going to appear on the first page. Okay, so we've now seen how we can add data into the context API. Let's now look at how we can remove data. So as you can see here, I have this list, and as I check items, I have an array which I'm storing in the state on the component of the IDs that are currently selected. So if I look at this in VS Code, let's come back over to posts. I have this selected array, which is being called whenever a selection is made or removed on the data grid component from Material UI. But that array of IDs is stored in selected. So what I can do is I can use that to actually dispatch an action to remove it from context. But we only want to do that when someone actually clicks on the delete button, which is here. So the first thing that we're going to do is come back over to our posts provider and work on our new function to remove items from our context. So let's create a new const called remove post, right? And what this is going to take is posts ID, right? And then what we'll do is we'll dispatch an action with a type and payload. So what we want to do here is come back over to our post types, and we're going to create a new type called remove post, right? And again, the name should be the same as the the value should be the same as the name of the key. And then the type of the action we're going to dispatch here is going to be our posts types dot remove post, and the payload is going to be our posts ID, which is what is passed into this function. And again, we can pass this into our provider's value object, and this is what we are basically going to have access to via context in our component. So when this gets dispatched, what we want to do is come back over to the reducer to actually handle removing them from our state and within our context. So all we have to do, because we're already importing our post types, is create a new case. So we'll create a case here, and we're going to say posts types dot remove post, and we're going to return the state, but we're going to make a change to our posts array. But we're not going to make the change within the reducer. What we're going to do is we're going to create a new utilities file. So we're going to say posts.utils.js, and we're going to use this utility function to remove the posts from our context that we are passing in the IDs of. So we're going to call this function remove from array. So we'll just say export const remove from array. And this function is going to take two things. So the first is the IDs to remove. This is going to be an array. And the second is the previous posts array. So we'll just say prev array. Now we want to make sure that those are two valid arrays when they're passed into the component. So we can do that by saying if they are not valid arrays. So we'll just say array.isArray and pass in this IDs to remove. And then we'll say if either that or array.isArray and pass in our previous array here. So if either of those return true, then we will return out of the function immediately. Otherwise, what we're going to do is we're going to say we're going to return the previous array, but we're going to filter where we get the item, but we destructure the ID, right? So we're going to destructure the ID, and then we will only return this true if the ID is not included in the array we passed in of IDs that we want to remove. So we'll say if this includes the ID. Okay, and then what we'll be able to do is use this within our reducer. So we need to import that at the top of the file. So we'll just import that from our utils file. Here we have utils. We're going to import what we call this utility function, which is remove from array, right? And then we'll just call that here for our posts state. So again, the first thing we need to pass in is our action.payload, and then it is our state.posts array. Okay, so now that we've done that, we can come back over to our component, and we're going to create a function on our posts component here. We're going to call this delete or handle delete, right? And actually, this is just going to be a function. We don't actually need to pass anything in here, but we do need to call this on the onClick event. So on our delete button, right? So on our delete button here, right, on the onClick event, we're going to call handle delete. And then all we're going to do here is we're already destructuring posts from context. So what we now want to do, if we look at our provider, we're also storing remove post. So we want to destructure as well remove post, and then when we call handle delete, we're going to call remove post, but we're going to pass in our array of IDs that are selected on the table with Material UI. Now there is one problem here, right? So we only want to actually dispatch this event when there is at least one ID in our array. So to check that, what we're going to do is we're going to say that if this is not a valid array, so we'll say array.isArray and pass in selected. And once we're confident that that is an array because it passed that, we're going to say that we'll say or if selected.length is less than 1, we will return out of the function immediately. Otherwise, we will continue to dispatch our action, which should remove the items from context. So let's now come back over to the browser. Let's select a few of these items and click on delete. And as you can see, they are removed from context. The next thing that I want to do is show you how you can use the same context within multiple components and how those components will update to keep in sync with each other whenever a change occurs to the context. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just display the total number of posts beside the posts text, the post label in the menu. So to do that, let's come back over to VS Code and go into our useReducer where we have our initial state, and I'm going to add in some new state. So what I'm going to do is say total posts count, and by default we have 5 posts, so I'm going to say the total number is currently 5. And then what I can do is come back over to my posts provider, and where I'm getting posts from the store, I can now destructure total posts count. And then what I can do is I can pass that into the value prop for the provider, and that gives me access to the total post count within the application. So I can come into my side menu component, which is a component we haven't looked at before, but again, this is all just Material UI. And again, I need to import that context. So I'll import that from the provider. So I'll come out into providers, posts, and my posts provider. And I want to import my posts context. And then from React, we also need to import our useContext hook. And at the top of the function, to access the content, we just have to call the useContext hook and pass in the posts context. And that will give me access to the total posts count. Now to display that beside my list item text, I am just going to use the backticks and I'll say posts and pass in the total posts count. And I'm probably also going to just wrap these in brackets. Okay, so as you can see, I'm now able to display the total number of posts beside the label in the menu. But what you'll also see that if I remove an item here, this number is not updating. So to fix that, what we need to do is come back over to the code and into my posts provider. And we need to dispatch another action whenever our posts array changes. So to do that, we're going to use the useEffect hook from React. And I'm going to put that here. So we'll just say useEffect, and that takes a function and a dependency array. And what the dependency array is it means that whenever this dependency changes, it will rerun the code within these two braces. So I'm going to pass in the posts array as a dependency to this useEffect hook. And I'm going to dispatch another action. So I'll say dispatch, and it needs a type. So what we actually need to do is create a new type. So I'll come back over to my post types, and I'm going to call this my set post count type. And again, the value should be the same as the name of the key. And then I can come back over to my provider, and I will dispatch the type of postTypes.setPostCount, and the payload is going to be posts.length, right? So this is what we're going to dispatch. So then all I have to do is now come back over to the reducer and create a new case. So I'll say postTypes.setPostCount, and where I will return the state, but I will update the total post count to be the action.payload. Okay, so now let's come back over to the code, and as you can see, again, it's 5, but if I remove an item, it changes to 4. If I come over to add a new post, let's add another item. So another great item, some content, and add that item. You can see again it increases to 5. And that's it for this video, but I will be sharing my code on GitHub. I'll put a link in the description of the video. But if you just want to find my GitHub page, it is github.com/simpletut. If you have enjoyed this tutorial and you'd like to see more of my content, then why not help me out and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to turn on notifications so when I do release new videos, you'll be notified and be able to find them. And you can find my website at simpletut.com, where I post all of my tutorials, and you'll be able to enroll in my courses for free, but track your progress through those courses through your own personal account.